On September 24, 1944, Enright was discharged from his desk and given command of the USS Archer Fish, which was just returning from her fourth war patrol. He rowed his new boat from Midway to Pearl Harbor, where she was intensively serviced, her stores replenished, and her crew rested and rotated. Under her new skipper, she set forth on her fifth war cruise on October 30, 1944. She and her men had a whale of an adventure awaiting them. Almost as crucial as Shinano's weaponry was the secrecy under which she was built. If the Americans learned of her presence in dry dock number 6 of Yokosuka Naval Shipyard on the west shore of Tokyo Bay, they would dispatch their B-29 seconds to pound her into rubble before she could take to her native element. Besides, if she could be completed and sent into action without the Allies knowing, her sudden appearance off the Philippines would be a devastating shock for them. Shinano was constructed within a massive, roofed concrete fence. Her dry dock was off limits to anyone not involved in her building. Imperial Kempai secret police patrolled the construction site, ensuring none of the sequestered workers left its confines, where they lived and worked 7 days per week. The laborers were threatened with imprisonment or execution if they revealed the ship's existence. Cameras were forbidden. Shinano was the only major warship built during the 20th century that was never officially photographed while under construction. The carrier was a formidable weapon. She was fitted with an 8-inch thick belt of armor above and below her water line. She bristled with 16 5-inch high-angle guns, 145 25mm cannons, and 12 4.7 inches rocket launchers capable of firing salvos of up to 30 projectiles. She was also fast. Her 4 main steam turbines could produce 150,000 shaft horsepower to push her along at up to 27 knots. Multiple fuel tanks gave her a range of 10,000 miles, with a full load displacement of 71,890 tons. Shinano was the biggest aircraft carrier built up to that time. Not until 1961, when the nuclear-powered USS Enterprise was launched, would any carrier exceed her in size. With the war going badly for Japan, the Naval High Command ordered the shipyard to deliver the behemoth for months earlier than planned. On October 5, 1944, the massive Maiden made a memorable entrance into her native element. At 8 that morning, the 5,000-ton caisson being used as a dry dock gate suddenly gave way with a shattering crash as its sealed dry dock seat unexpectedly yielded to the enormous force of water pressure. With the level of water in the bay much higher than the floor of the dry dock, tons of seawater flowed into the dock, lifting massive Shinano and hurling her forward like a cork 100 feet into the dock's headwall while 140 mooring lines snapped. As the invading water surged into the confined dry dock, it hurled the carrier back and forth 3 times until the water level inside and outside the dock equalized and the motion died down. By some miracle, nobody was killed, although scores of sailors and workmen on the ship and in the dry dock were injured. New workers and sailors were conscripted to replace the wounded. None came willingly, for as Shinano's self-inflicted damage was being hastily repaired, superstitious seamen were already whispering that the accident was an ill omen and this mammoth maiden was jinxed. When she put to sea, her crew's morale would be affected accordingly, and many of her men were not surprised when her fate came quickly. The carrier steamed from the shipyard for builders' trials on November 11th, and civilian authorities delivered her to the Navy 9 days later. That same day, intelligence officers briefed Captain Abe on reports that American submarines had sortied from Saipan and Guam on November 10th and 11th, presumably headed for the home islands. In hopes of evading these predators, Abe waited until after nightfall on November 28th to take his ship out of Tokyo Harbor and head south. His course was to sail past Irosaki and Ashima and finally into the inland seaport city of Kure to the west, where he would take on his aircraft. Shinano was to carry 20 fighters, 20 bombers, and 7 scout planes. She already packed 50 Oka suicide planes and 6 Shinyo suicide speedboats. Destroyers Isakes, Yukikes, and Hamakes escorted the carrier. Had they suddenly popped up off some contested island, Shinano and her destroyers would have been a bitter shock to the Allies. First, though, Abe had to get his fleet fully armed. Leveling off at a depth of 60 feet, Enright yelled, "Flood the tubes." Set depth on the torpedoes at 10 feet. Such a shallow depth setting befuddled some of the crewmen. But Enright was thinking back to a conversation he had a year earlier with Rear Admiral Freeland Daubin. The Admiral had opined that torpedo hits on a carrier should come just under the waterline because the great weight of the flight deck would destabilize the ship in the event of flooding high in her hull. This would make the vessel prone to capsizing and sinking more rapidly than flooding in the lower decks, which would result in her settling slowly in the water and in a upright position. Enright was also aware that his Mark 14 torpedoes were known to run deeper than the depths for which they were set. He figured the 10 feet depth setting would cater to both considerations. When the nervous Abe next ordered a 30-degree turn to port, he inadvertently turned his ship broadside to the submarine. Waiting for the carrier to pass in front of him, Enright had time to study her minutely through the attack periscope. Her outline did not match any in the recognition manual, so he drew a quick sketch of her. Ensign Gordon Crosby squinted at the drawing, noting the ship's peculiar rounded bow designed to cut down wind resistance, and remarked, "The Japanese don't have anything like that." "The hell they don't. I'm looking at it," Enright retorted. At this point, Archer Fish had to drop beneath periscope depth as a destroyer passed directly over her. So close its prop wash shook the submarine. Luckily for the Americans, the destroyer was one of those whose sonar was inoperable from recent battle damage, and she blithely turned away from the sub. The destroyer's passing forced Enright to attack about a minute later than he had intended. but the carrier still filled the periscope's field of view as he barked. Fire 1. The firing plunger was pushed for times at 8-second intervals. The crew hastily reloaded the tubes, and 2 more torpedoes were fired. His eyes glued to the periscope, and Wright watched the first 2 balls of fire erupt against the vessel's hull, and was stunned at how quickly she listed. He resisted the temptation to keep watching, and, delighted by the sound of additional strikes, ordered, "Take her down to 400 feet. Rig for depth charge attack." Patting his rosary, he looked at his watch. It was 3:22 a.m., November 29, 1944. 2 destroyers were now above the Americans, who could hear depth charges splashing into the sea. What the submariners did not know was that the warships attacking them had no operable sonar. But they soon figured it out as they counted 14 depth charge explosions over a 15-minute stretch. None came anywhere near Archer Fish. "They don't know where we are," breathed a relieved Wright. "Damned if they don't know where we are." Virtually the entire crew whispered, "Praise the Lord." For 20 minutes the sailors listened to the fading sounds of depth charges and of the carrier breaking up. As realization of their success dawned on the crew, the sub reverberated with war whoops, rebel yells, and the patter of thousands of backslaps. Soon, however, the men grew silent as they began to contemplate the magnitude of their accomplishment. They were heroes, but only slowly did they gain total awareness of the hard-earned status. At 6:10 a.m., Wright eased his vessel to periscope depth but, despite excellent visibility in the morning sunlight, could spot nothing in any direction. Exhausted, he headed for his bunk. At 10:55 a sailor woke him to say, "Cap'n, sonar heard." In fact, we all heard a deep rumbling explosion pretty far off. The officer on duty said to tell you he thinks it was our target going to the bottom. The skipper smiled and went back to sleep. An hour after the attack, Abe finally allowed himself to realize the gravity of the situation. A vessel 1/30th the size of his had defeated him. The scorned American torpedoes had mortally wounded his carrier. Her list was now 20 degrees, and her speed down to 10 knots. At 6 a.m. he ordered her course changed to the northwest in hopes of beaching the Shinano off Cape Ushio. Water poured through countless small, internal leaks that there had been no time to find and fix in the shipyard, and crewmen desperately resorted to forming bucket brigades. The water kept rising. At 8 a.m., Abe ordered the flooding of the outboard port boiler rooms, in a frantic bid to reduce the list by counterflooding. Briefly the carrier did right herself, but soon the torrent pouring through the 4 gaping wounds in the starboard hull began pulling her aslant again. By 9 a.m., she was dead in the water and her list was 20 degrees. Throughout Shinano's vast interior, men, who had feared all along that their ship was hexed, were struggling upward, hoping to make it to the deck before she capsized. Hamikes and Isakes made a pathetic effort to tow the carrier to shallow water, but with a combined weight of just 5,000 tons they could not budge the 72,000-ton vessel, which was made heavier still by the addition of thousands of tons of seawater. At 10:18, Abe gave the general order to abandon ship. Aboard Yokosuka, Captain Tarachi ordered his executive officer, "Lieutenant, don't pick up any sailors who cry or call for help. Such faint hearts can do the Navy no good. Pick up only the strong ones, who remain calm and courageous." Many more men drowned than were rescued. Abe was among 1,435 men who went down with their ship.